Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Okay, you know the drill, the intertwining, the chiasm. This is the last chapter of the book. This is our fourth video. And I did say last week that this was going to be the last video, but I did also say hopefully, and it's good that I did because it's not going to be the last video, it turns out. I just couldn't squeeze everything into one video, everything that I wanted to talk about into this single video. I mean, obviously I could have, but I would have had to broad brush my way through too much stuff, and there is a lot of good stuff in this last part of this chapter. So yeah, I didn't want to kind of breeze through it too casually, too lightly. That's not how these videos work. So one more video to come after this, and what we're going to be talking about in this video and the next one is Merleau-Ponty's notion of idea. And basically, if I can just say a little bit about that now, this is how he sees mind, what we would traditionally have called mind or consciousness. But in the same way that in the last video he used the word intercorporeity instead of other people, I think he's doing the same thing here. It's not doesn't completely get away from traditional philosophy, because idea obviously has been used a lot with, in particular, Plato, but it gets away from the more mind/consciousness kind of approach that has been more popular in modern times anyway. And so yeah, idea or thought are words that Merleau-Ponty favors over mind or consciousness, but he's getting at the same idea, just rethinking those terms within his quite novel, I think, ontological framework of flesh. So with that said, the first part of the video is the second meaning of vision, idea, part 1. So I think I'll start this section off with a quote. Thought is a relationship with oneself and with the world, as well as a relationship with the other. Hence, it is established in the 3 dimensions at the same time, and it must be brought to appear directly in the infrastructure of vision. We are asking precisely what is that central vision that joins the scattered visions, that unique touch that governs the whole tactile life of my body as a unit, that I think that must be able to accompany all our experiences. So okay, thought appears in all 3 dimensions, self, world, other. That's a framework that I've brought to your attention before. It underlies, it kind of structures the whole book. It's present in the background and everything that Merleau-Ponty talks about. So there it is again with regard to idea this time. He talks about, so he says, we're talking about that central vision that joins the scattered visions, the unique touch that governs the whole tactile life of my body, that I think that must accompany all of our experiences. And in particular, that last part, that I think. This is why I think that Merleau-Ponty is talking about things like Descartes' cogito, Kant's apperception, mind, consciousness, all of those traditional terms. He's talking about this, but he's completely redefining it. He's completely rethinking it. So he's using this maybe less familiar, in a modern sense anyway, less familiar word, idea or thought, but not a specific thought, the thought that you're thinking right now, for instance, but thought in general, if you like. Idea in general. And as we go on, I think what Merleau-Ponty has in mind will become clearer. But nevertheless, he is addressing the same thing that Descartes and Kant and everybody else was trying to address when they talked about mind or consciousness. Another thing that's important here is he says thought must be brought to appear. So he talks about the appearing of thought. And he specifically says he's not interested in trying to decide here whether thought is simply appearing for us, as in it was always there already, or whether thought is emerging, whether it's being born, he says, the birth of thought. He's not addressing that question here, whether it's always there or whether it comes about. He says he's not addressing it yet, which suggests that he did want to address it later. Obviously, he never did. So we're putting that kind of a more metaphysical question perhaps to the side and simply dealing with how thought appears to us, how idea appears for us. And finally, he says it appears directly in the infrastructure of vision. I think this is important because it tells us that Merleau-Ponty is going in a different direction with this. He's not going the direction of a Kant or a Descartes or any other traditional approach to mind or consciousness, which would pull thought, pull mind out of the world, out of the physical, and place it in an internal domain where it's detached from, where we can even in theory think of it as detached from the physical, from the sensible. Since he says we have to think thought in the infrastructure of vision, it means it's going to be a part of Merleau-Ponty's ontology, which means it's going to be bound up inextricably with the body, with the flesh, with our engagement with things in the world. And he even says on the next page, one must see or feel in some way in order to think. There's no, and by that he means more than just you need a body and a brain in order to think. Most people would agree with that. But he's going further to say that it's not just the case that once you have that, then thought is this disengaged spectator kind of mind which surveys the physical and the sensible from a distance. Yes, you need a body and a brain in order to think, in order to have thoughts, to be a mind, but even then, the mind is still, even when you are thinking, even as mind, it's still intimately connected to the world, to the things around it, to the sensible, through flesh, as we'll see a little bit later on. And that's actually the end part of that quote. Every thought known to us occurs to a flesh. So really driving that point home, this account of mind or consciousness is going to be something completely different from what has come before him. So we've got that little quote there, every thought known to us occurs to a flesh, and what we'll do in the second part of the video is just revisit this word flesh, just go over some of the core concepts, and then we will look at one concept that we haven't fully explored yet, and it's that's going to kind of open up the path into what Merleau-Ponty means by idea. So that's the second part of the video, flesh. So let's run through a couple of the ideas that we've already, that's a tricky word, let's run through a couple of the main features of flesh that we've already looked at. First up, the intertwining. Flesh is the coiling over of the visible upon the seeing body, of the tangible upon the touching body, such that simultaneously, as tangible, it descends among them. As touching, it dominates them all and draws this relationship and even this double relationship from itself by dehiscence or fission of its own mass. So this is really just the intertwining, the chiasm, the notion that to be a seer, we must also be visible. We must also be seen. To touch, we must also be tangible. Just reminding us of that. The second aspect of flesh here is the relation between me as seer and the thing as seen. This magical relation, this pact between them and me, according to which I lend them my body in order that they inscribe upon it and give me their resemblance. This fold, this central cavity of the visible, which is my vision. These two mirror arrangements of the seeing and the visible, the touching and the touched, form a close-bound system, define a vision in general and a constant style of visibility from which I cannot detach myself. So a lot of the key ideas of flesh kind of in that quote. I lend things my body and they inscribe upon it their resemblance. Such a great description. A description of first the intertwining, the way that my body, the way that I as seer am nevertheless seen. I'm nevertheless in the world as a visible object. And the way that when I see something, when I see an object, it's not just this, as I was saying before, it's not just this kind of a detached spectator mind looking out on things external to itself. It's more intimate than that. The things inscribe their resemblances upon my body. I am in this intimate relationship, that there's a strong, deep connection here with the world and things that is often missed, I think, in traditional philosophy, especially when it comes to trying to understand mind or consciousness. He goes on to talk about ourselves as seers, as a fold or as a central cavity of the visible, which is my vision. Again, a nice way of talking about us, a nice emphasis that we are immersed in flesh as this body which is a sensible for itself, which is a perspective opening out within flesh. They form a close-bound system, mirror arrangements of the seeing and the visible. Again, this deep connection. And at the very end, he talks about vision in general. And that, remember, is a key notion. We're talking about, at this level of ontology, we're talking about generalities, anonymity. Because it's those things, it's this, the generality, which is prior to and constitutive of our individuality. The anonymity precedes the self. The general precedes the individual. So in order, if we start with the individual, we have no chance of properly understanding ontology. We've got to start with this vision in general. And also he mentions the constant style of visibility. And style is again an important word because it has that sense that the general conditions the individual. It determines how the individual is going to appear as the individual that it is. And the last feature here then is flesh as element. We must not think the flesh starting from substances, from body and spirit, for then it would be the union of contradictories. But we must think it, as we said, as an element, as the concrete emblem of a general manner of being. Flesh is not substance, it's not body, and in particular it's not body and spirit, i.e. consciousness or mind, because then we have to try and enforce these two opposing essences, these opposing substances together. And you'll never do that in a satisfactory manner. Body and spirit are secondary abstractions taken out from this generality, this more primordial, original generality, which is flesh. And we use that word element, flesh as element, as instead of substance then, to describe flesh as a general manner of being, rather than a particular thing. Rather, it's a style. It's a molding, conditioning force. And finally, then we've got this. It's an old idea. It's one that we talked about in the last video, but Merleau-Ponty is going to deepen it a little bit here. And the idea is the reversibility of the seeing and visible, the way that we can be. My right hand, for example, can be both touching my left hand, but also touched. It can be. I can understand the world from the perspective of my left hand touching, in which case my right hand is touched. This reversibility between myself as sensing and as sensible in a general sense. This reversibility is always imminent and never realized in fact. My left hand is always on the verge of touching my right hand touching the things, but I never reach coincidence. Likewise, I do not hear myself as I hear the others. The sonorous existence of my voice is for me, as it were, poorly exhibited. I have rather an echo of its articulated existence. It vibrates through my head rather than outside. I am always on the same side of my body. So, okay, there doesn't seem to be too much. This doesn't seem to be that significant, but it will turn out to be, I think, in the next section. So my left hand can be both touched and touching, but it can't be both simultaneously. Likewise, in a similar way with my voice is never heard like I hear other people's voices. The voice that I speak is never, it's never the voice that I hear from outside. So I can't experience that. And again, it's kind of obvious. Doesn't seem particularly earth-shattering. And even when Merleau-Ponty says the reason for this, right? The reason I can't hear my voice the way I hear other people's is because I'm always on the same side of my body. I'm always this focal point, this perspective. I'm never a detached, purely objective spectator. So it is a little bit important, significant actually, maybe a little bit insightful. This placing of us in our bodies rather than pretending or imagining that we can be a detached mind, a disembodied thought, thinking things purely objectively. We're always located somewhere, and that locus is our body. Same thing with touch. The reason my left hand is never both touched and touching is because my hands belong to the same body. I can't have both of those experiences at once, because I am located at this particular juncture, in this particular body. I'm not, no matter how, I'm not even in theory, I'm not a detached mind. I am anchored in this physical perspective, which is my body. So that is kind of interesting. It is kind of insightful, but that's not the insight I'm angling towards. The insight that I'm angling towards will come in the next part of the video, which is the second meaning of vision, idea part 2. Okay, so we just talked about the way that my left hand, for example, actually let's go right hand. My right hand can never be both touched and touching at the same time. So now we're going to focus on this hinge, Merleau-Ponty calls it, this hinge that is the transition between these two experiences, touching and touched. And in particular, the way that it can never be experienced. But this hiatus between my right hand touched and my right hand touching, between my voice heard and my voice uttered, between one moment of my tactile life and the following one, is not an ontological void, a non-being. It is spanned by the total being of my body and by that of the world. It is the zero of pressure between two solids that makes them adhere to one another. My flesh and that of the world therefore involve clear zones, clearings, about which pivot their opaque zones, and the primary visibility, that of the qualia and of the things, does not come without a second visibility, that of the lines of force and dimensions, the massive flesh without a rarefied flesh. Okay, so that is, I think, a really important quote. And it's really the center, the center point of this video, I think. Okay. The way that I want to approach this is to break it down into two parts. The first part and obviously the second part. The first half of that quote, though, Merleau-Ponty talks about essentially the hinge, the point of inflection, we might say, where where touching becomes touched, or vice versa, touched becomes touching, is the unexperienceable total being of my body and that of the world. That's kind of the central idea here. So let's work through the first half of that quote. The point of inflection is not, Merleau-Ponty says, an ontological void. It's not non-being. However, because it's not experienced, and because in fact it's not experienceable, it's nothing positive. It is, Merleau-Ponty says, the zero of pressure between the two experiences. The zero, as we said, is not nothing, it's not non-being, in part because it makes these two experiences adhere to one another. It's the link, it's the connection which holds them together into one total body. And that's the next point. The experienceable touching and touched are joined by, are held together by a non-experienceable hinge, which is spanned by the total being of my body and that of the world. So this point, this moment between my body is touched and my body is touching, is, despite being non-experienced, despite not being experienced, is not nothing. It is my the total being of my body and that of the world. So it's like that. It's the ontological fulcrum, if you like, for those two experiences. It's never experienced itself, but it's not nothing. It's vitally important because it's that point of inflection, that fulcrum, which holds those two experiences, the touched and the touching, my voice heard versus my voice uttered, which holds them together. And like I said, that I think a good word there is ontological fulcrum. It's that point of connection that brings those two aspects, which are vital, right? Which are central to Merleau-Ponty's ontology. The notion that we, as seeing, we must also be visible. As vision, we must also be visible. As touching, we must also be tangible. That's central to Merleau-Ponty's ontology. And this fulcrum, this hinge then, is, despite the fact that it's never experienced, is a vital structural aspect of his ontology. Okay, so that's the first half anyway. The second half then introduces this idea of second visibility. And he starts by talking about, actually before we look at it, we have to remember the division, the dual aspect, I think I called it once, of flesh, which was the body as sensible for itself, that which generated distance, and flesh as the invisible milieu. Kind of separated those as two aspects. I brought them together a couple of videos back, showing that they're basically two expressions for the same thing. But Merleau-Ponty separates them, keeps them separate here as well. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention again. So in that quote, he says, in the appearing of things, this zero of pressure, this point of inflection, this hinge between my flesh as touching and the flesh of the world as touched, constitute clear zones or clearings, which we can think of as focal points, which are the primary visibility. These are the qualia and the things, the visibles. And around those pivot opaque zones. And these are the second visibility, which is what Merleau-Ponty means by idea. Okay, so there's quite a lot in that little sentence. So let's see if we can clarify. The point of inflection. We've got that point of inflection between, say, touching and touched. It's not experienced, but it's not nothing. It's our ontological fulcrum. And it's there that what Merleau-Ponty is calling clearings or clear zones emerge. This is where, to use a spatial analogy, this is where visibles appear. And Merleau-Ponty calls those here primary visibilities. So this is the things. This is the qualia. They appear in this clearing created by this ontological fulcrum. And around that fulcrum, though, are these opaque zones, so unclear zones, which Merleau-Ponty calls the second visibility, and these are the idea. And what we'll see, what does Merleau-Ponty mean by idea? He means the lines of force and dimensions. And what that means is that which structures the primary visibility, that which structures the thing. So lines of force, it's like you can imagine lines of force, but you can imagine that they impose themselves upon the thing. They condition the thing such that it orients itself according to those lines of force. That's the metaphor here. Dimensions, again, dimensions in the same way. Dimensions as in structuring features, the way that the shape, the form, the depth of things is being conditioned, is being determined by these opaque zones around the thing, around the primary visibility. And that I think is the main idea in this whole video. That's what ideas are. They are conditioning, structuring forces. And I think one way to imagine this is to think of an X, the letter X, where one line would be, one stroke would be the touched, the other would be the touching. And at the intersection, that's our point of inflection here. That's our ontological fulcrum. That is the clearing that Merleau-Ponty is talking about. That's where the clearing emerges, arises, and it's there that the visible appears. And around that intersection are these opaque zones, and they are the ideas which, the lines of force around which the primary visibility is oriented, which allow that primary visibility to be the thing that it is. So essentially then what we're looking at here is the bond between flesh and idea. And that's my next quote. The bond between the flesh and the idea, between the visible and the interior armature which it manifests and which it conceals. The relations between the visible and the invisible in describing an idea that is not the contrary of the sensible, that is its lining and its depth. Okay, so flesh as body and world, right? Flesh as those two aspects brought together. That's primary visibility. That's where primary visibility appears within that flesh of which we are a part, of which we must be a part in order to be a perspective in the first place. And the idea is another nice expression, the interior armature, which, so acting as like the framework around which the primary visibility can, or within which the primary visibility can appear. And that idea is the second visibility. Good. So Merleau-Ponty explicitly calls this bond between flesh and idea a bond between the visible, that's flesh, and the invisible, which is the idea or second visibility. So it could be a little bit confusing because we're talking about flesh as visible, whereas all through the last few videos I've been talking about flesh as invisible. But what Merleau-Ponty means when he says the flesh is visible here is it's not that the flesh itself is visible, it's that it is as primary visibility. It's where the thing appears. The thing appears within flesh, and to that extent, you could possibly gloss it by saying that part of flesh becomes visible, becomes something, becomes a certain qualia. You could, I think that's one way to think about this. So flesh is invisible, but when we're bringing in the notion of idea, flesh as this particular part of flesh, if you like, to use a very kind of crude analogy, crude metaphor, a part of flesh becomes visible, and that is the thing, that's the object. So it's similar to the earlier distinction we made between visible as the object and the invisible as the milieu, the flesh. But now we're just applying that same distinction to flesh and idea. So the visible becomes flesh as primary visibility, as clearing, the clearing within which the visible becomes the visible, and this second visibility, which is the idea. So in the first case, in the first split between object and flesh, milieu, the concern there was with the way that flesh imposed a style upon a particular sensible. And we looked at the example of red, the colour red, how this red of, I forget what it was, a dress maybe, this red was conditioned by or determined by an invisible milieu which included other reds, the red of that flag, the red of that something else over there, all of these other different, still sensible, though I think that's an important distinction. These other sensible notions determined or conditioned that particular object. And now with the distinction between primary visibility and second visibility, we're looking at the style of not a particular sensible, but the style of flesh, the style of this clearing, and how this clearing, primary visibility, is conditioned by a different invisible, and we could use the word milieu again, of ideas which serve to structure, define, determine how this clearing presents the visible to us, presents the object, presents the qualia. Nice. So another thing that's important from that quote is the notion that the idea is not the opposite of the sensible. So it's not, which immediately opens up a kind of dualistic framework, mind, body, the psychic, the physical, anything like that. We don't want to think of the idea as the opposite of the sensible because it is its lining and its depth. It is the interior armature. It is those lines of force and dimensions which structure the sensible. So it's closely, intimately, I'm using that word a lot in this video, it's intimately connected to the sensible. So really just drilling home this idea, driving home this idea that the mind is not something separate from the sensible. It's not something detached. It's not an objective spectator. It's enmeshed in the very appearing of things. It's enmeshed in the way that things become visible. And that's essentially the core of Merleau-Ponty's ontology, right? He gives an example of an idea, but an example of a musical idea. So he talks about, from Proust's In Search of Lost Time, he talks about Swann's little phrase. And this refers to a musical line in the book which Swann hears, and for him embodies, not just embodies, but it presents to him the essence of love. And so the essence of love, that's the idea here. And so if we think about it in terms of that, this sequence of musical notes, so sensible notes, this presents, it evokes for Swann this idea. So first up, if we analyze what Merleau-Ponty said about idea through this example, the little phrase of Swann's, the musical notes, which are again sensible, are structured. They're given their lining and depth by the idea. And it's because of that they can present that idea to Swann. They're only able to, the notes themselves are only able to present this idea because they are informed by it. They are conditioned by it. They are structured by it. And just to use some more of Merleau-Ponty's terminology, the idea is the invisible armature supporting the notes, the sensible notes. It provides the lines of force and dimensions that order those notes. Again, all different ways of expressing the same thing, the way that the idea conditions, structures the sensible. So again, the idea, the essence of love is invisible, whereas the notes themselves are visible. They're sensible. Visible in the sense that they're sensible. And the idea, another important point here, the idea only appears through the sensible musical notes. So in general, we're brought to the idea only through the sensible. A really important notion here, because again, trying to get past this way of thinking of ideas and thoughts and mind as completely separate from the physical. Yes, it emerges from, perhaps requires a body and a brain, but once you have that, the mind is this thing that operates on its own. Merleau-Ponty is saying, no, the idea it only appears to us through the sensible. However, despite this, the idea is not explicitly graspable or positively expressible. The notes make present for Swann the essence of love, even though, as Merleau-Ponty says, it is unbeknown to the listeners themselves. And even though later they do not know how to recognize it in the loves they only witness. So I think another way to put this is to say that ideas have to be lived, not intellectualized, not cognized, not merely thought. And because of that, they're not the kind of thing that can be reduced to an abstract proposition, a linguistic formulation. They have to have this deeper sense of you only really know an idea once you have lived it. Which isn't to say, of course, that words, that language can't be used to help clarify ideas. Of course, to point you in the direction of ideas, of course they can, but of course it can, but unless you have that experience to call on, the words will be empty shells. They're not going to unlock the essence, the idea for you without that experience. And to that extent, they're not explicitly graspable in kind of abstract, formulaic expressions. They're not positively expressible. It's something that you know, and this is why we have that experience. I think we have, when something makes sense to us, we read something and it clicks, it resonates with us. These are the ways we talk about it. Very not abstract, not objective, not detached, but very. It's almost a bodily kind of expression. That idea just it clicked when I read it. We're not talking about a detached spectator here. We're talking about something that it's almost visceral. It's almost carnal when we describe it. The way ideas resonate with us. There's a real sense of living the idea rather than it all taking place in some detached internal mind realm, right? So I think that's kind of comes across in this example of Swann's little phrase. And I'll note this, and this won't be the last, it's not the first time and it won't be the last time I note this, but this is very reminiscent of Deleuze's ideas as well. Even the word, the fact that Deleuze uses the word idea. And a lot of the ways that Merleau-Ponty is talking about his ideas here really seem to map on quite closely to Deleuze. It's weird that he didn't mention him more in Difference and Repetition. Another mystery for the ages. Like Merleau-Ponty seldom mentions Bergson, although there's a lot that he seems to borrow from him. There's a lot that he could have perhaps noted in some way, mentioned Bergson as having kind of spurred on his thought in some way. Same with Deleuze, right? He doesn't mention Merleau-Ponty at all, really. Which again is weird because this is so... The parallels are really quite clear, down to the name, down to the word that they use to talk about mind, ideas. Anyway, whatever. Merleau-Ponty goes on to talk about different kinds of ideas. Another way that Deleuze talks about ideas. Okay, anyway, enough Deleuze. So the quote, literature, music, the passions, but also the experience of the visible world are, no less than is the science of Lavoisier and Ampere, the exploration of an invisible and the disclosure of a universe of ideas. The difference is simply that this invisible, these ideas, unlike those of that science, cannot be detached from the sensible appearances and be erected into a second positivity. So, okay, kind of equating the ideas in the humanities, essentially, in life, with the ideas of science. All of these domains, disciplines, they are all exploring and disclosing an invisible universe of ideas. So they're all doing something similar. The difference, though, is that the ideas of science can be detached from the sensible appearances and become a second positivity. And if you think about things like scientific models, theories, that's, I think, what Merleau-Ponty has in mind here. You can pull those ideas out of the sensible world and create a structure which stands alone, which can be seen as independent. And that is exactly what we see happening these days, right? Models, I would argue, models have taken precedence for most scientists now, such that what they're really concerned with is the model, not the reality. And you get things like model-dependent realism. Stephen Hawking talked about that, in which the idea is basically the models are all we have. We don't know what reality is really like, so there's no point in even thinking about it. All we know is, all we have are our observations and the empirical results of experiments, and we just have to construct models which include those observations and results. And those are all we've got. So we focus on the models, not on what any of this means or what reality might actually be. And like I say, Stephen Hawking talked about it in one of the books he wrote, co-authored actually. The Grand Design, I think is what it was called. And I was kind of glad to see that, because it's something I do believe, that scientists don't investigate reality itself. They don't describe reality. They're not trying to understand reality. They're trying to model it. And once they have that model, that lets them do things. It lets them intervene in the world in certain ways. And it's incredibly effective. It's the perfect tool for that. But it doesn't tell us anything about reality. And it was kind of refreshing to see Hawking acknowledge that, although he was acknowledging it in a way that he also said philosophy's dead in that same book. So he was acknowledging it in a way that, as if it's the only option we have. We can't know reality as it really is. All we've got are the models. I definitely don't think that's the case. But for however it works out, I think Hawking's right in the sense that that's what science does. Science investigates reality. It models reality. It doesn't investigate reality itself. Okay, so the ideas of science can be detached, but as we saw, ideas for us as philosophers only appear through the sensible, which is given its lining and its depth by them. So very different from a different approach from science. We're not creating models. We're not creating theories which could stand alone from, which could be independent from the sensible. The mind or consciousness idea for Merleau-Ponty is intimately connected to the sensible, such that ideas only appear for us through the sensible. And this, I think, is a good place, is a good springboard to investigate ideas in some more detail. So I've got a long quote, which I'll give you, and then we'll just pull out some of the important points from it. But it is as though the secrecy wherein ideas lie, and whence the literary expression draws them, were their proper mode of existence. For these truths are not only hidden like a physical reality, which we have not been able to discover, invisible in fact, but which we will one day be able to see facing us, which others better situated could already see, provided that the screen that masks it is lifted. Here, on the contrary, there is no vision without the screen. The ideas we are speaking of would not be better known to us if we had no body and no sensibility. It is then that they would be inaccessible to us. The little phrase, the notion of light could not be given to us as ideas except in a carnal experience. It is not only that we would find in that carnal experience the occasion to think them, it is that they owe their authority, their fascinating, indestructible power, precisely to the fact that they are in transparency behind the sensible, or in its heart. Each time we want to get at it immediately, or lay hands on it, or circumscribe it, or see it unveiled, we do in fact feel that the attempt is misconceived, that it retreats in the measure that we approach. The explicitation does not give us the idea itself, it is but a second version of it, a more manageable derivative. Okay, nice. So ideas are permanently invisible. They're invisible by definition, not because they're in some transcendent realm or divine or in an internal domain like a Cartesian theatre kind of situation, which no one believes in, but everybody seems to, it kind of underpins most ideas of consciousness. But because they provide the interior armature, the lines of force and dimensions for the things we can see or grasp. They must be invisible because it's because they condition, they structure what is visible. So we never see them because we're always seeing with them. And this kind of leads into the next point, which is the screen. The screen that Merleau-Ponty talks about is the things, visibles, sensibles, including our bodies as sensible things. Some people imagine that we can pierce this screen, in which case it's usually talked about as something like the veil of Maya, to see reality as it really is. Typically, this is a kind of mystical approach. Others acknowledge that we can't get behind the screen, but if we could do that, we would discover the truth of reality. Merleau-Ponty says no to both of these. There is no vision without the screen. The ideas we are speaking of would not be better known to us if we had no body and no sensibility. It's then that they would be inaccessible to us. Ideas are only accessible through the visible. And the visible is, and that the reason is that the visible is conditioned by those ideas. The ideas provide I like that word, the lines of force. They provide the lining, the depth, which makes the visible be the visible that it is. So if we had no body, no sensibility, if we got rid of the visibles so that we could, as we often imagine, perceive with our minds only, we wouldn't see anything. We wouldn't have a clearer view of the ideas, because the only way ideas appear at all is in the visible. They're intimately connected, interwoven with the sensible realm. And the analogy that I thought, it's an analogy you've probably heard before. I'm sure I've used it before, but it's something like a pair of glasses. You can't, if you're completely blind without them, say, for the purpose of the analogy, you can never see the glasses because you're always using them in order to see. The world becomes visible for you because of your glasses. So if you take them off, so you can see purely, if you to put it a different way, trying to see the glasses themselves, you'll never see anything because you need your glasses to see anything. And that's kind of I think the analogy here with the screen. the screen is not something you can ever get rid of, because that's what it is to see, is that screen. Without that screen, there is no visible, there is no seeing. And what makes that visible appear are the ideas that condition it. So ideas, Merleau-Ponty says, can only be given as ideas in a carnal experience. Not for the trivial reason that without bodies and sensibility we wouldn't be here to think anything at all, but because it is what ideas are, namely the transparency behind the sensible. That is what they are. Take away the sensible, you take away the ideas. And also, again, just re-emphasizing this idea, ideas cannot be positively, explicitly explained. The attempt gives instead a secondary derivative version of the idea itself. Again, not because ideas are mysterious or transcendent or anything else like that, unable to be captured by something as coarse as language or concepts, but because they are the warp and woof of what we say or think. These ideas are the conditioning forces, the structuring features of everything we say and think. And that's why they can't be taken out of that context meaningfully. Again, of course we can describe them, we can talk about them, we can write them down, we can formulate them in language, but there's never that precision. That's why it's so difficult, actually, and I can say this as someone who does quite a bit of writing. It is difficult to really perfectly capture what the sentiment that I have in mind, the idea that I have. It's really difficult to write it in such a way that I know it can be understood by a reader, that it can't be, so that it can be understood and that it can't be misunderstood or misinterpreted. It's really difficult to create, to reproduce the idea that I have on paper. Again, not so much because language is coarse and ideas are ethereal or belong to some kind of different realm, but just because the ideas are so tightly bound up with your experience. In order to really know the ideas, in order for me to really convey my ideas, it's almost like when I'm writing, I'm trying to get you to experience the world the way I do. That's kind of what I'm trying to convey, is not an abstract idea, but my experience, which will let that idea stand out, come forth for you. Anyway, so that's kind of this notion that ideas can't be positively, explicitly captured in that kind of format. So, for example, the essence of love, right? That little phrase. This is about as abstract as it gets, love. But still, without carnal experiences like Swann's little phrase, the sensible, the actual musical notes, without the experience of loving and knowing what it is to love someone and to be loved, we wouldn't be able to grasp it at all. You would never understand it if it were just presented to you without this background, this broader experience to call on, and without some kind of sensible almost trigger, some kind of sensible object or experience which expresses that idea of what love is, the essence of love. Another one is time. You might want to object that, well, what about time? Time is completely abstract, right? There's no, how can we live time, as it were? But that's exactly what we do, right? There is nothing to think about. There would be nothing to say about it if you had never experienced temporality. If you didn't actually live time, you could never possibly grasp what time is through an explicit proposition, through an expression, through language or through speech or whatever. And so, let me give you the final quote for today. We do not see, do not hear the ideas, and not even with the mind's eye or with the third ear, and yet they are there, behind the sounds or between them, behind the lights or between them, recognizable through their always special, always unique manner of entrenching themselves behind them. And that's just a nice summary of the way ideas are in every sensible, in every visible, but in such a way that they themselves never appear. Hence, they're invisible. And they're invisible because rather than appearing explicitly, they provide the lines of force, the dimensions, the axes along which visibles are oriented. So, if I can kind of bring this back to where we started, that central vision then that joins all the scattered visions, that cogito, that I think, that Merleau-Ponty talks about at the very beginning of the video, that I talked about, that I mentioned Merleau-Ponty talks about at the very beginning of the video, is actually worldly. It has more to do with the body and flesh than with a mind or a consciousness. And that really is the insight we were looking for. And hopefully I've been able to capture that for you here. So let's have a look at a summary. So today was all about the second meaning of vision, what Merleau-Ponty calls idea. And this is, we defined early on, as the central vision that joins the scattered visions. So it is the equivalent essentially of the cogito, or Kant's apperception, Kant's I think, or mind or consciousness, but this is Merleau-Ponty trying to completely redefine, completely rethink the notion of mind. So we're using this other term, idea. He also uses thought, but he also uses second visibility, and bringing in the word vision and visibility there connects us to Merleau-Ponty's broader ontological program here. So already we have the sense that this is not going to be a detached spectator mind, a separate substance. Already this is going to be connected and enmeshed in Merleau-Ponty's ontology. So we looked at flesh, we looked at some of covered some of the ideas that we've talked about before, but the new idea was that this reversibility between touched and touching, between my voice as spoken and my voice as heard, is never realized in fact. So I never experience the touching and the touched together. And this produces the unexperienceable hinge. Another word Merleau-Ponty used for this, the hiatus, the zero of pressure. I talked about it as a point of inflection or an ontological fulcrum. And it's not, despite the fact that it's not experienced and can't be experienced, it's not an ontological void. It's not non-being. Rather, it's spanned by the total being of my body and that of the world. So it's essentially spanned by flesh. That's where flesh arises, in between this touching and touched, and this point of inflection. And it's this which connects those two experiences. It's this non-experienced fulcrum which connects and holds together the two different experiences. And further, this unexperienceable hinge constitutes clear zones or clearings, primary visibility, around which pivot opaque zones, the second visibility. And so this is the distinction between qualia and things, which appear in flesh as this, in these clear zones or clearings, which Merleau-Ponty calls primary visibility here, and around which we have these opaque zones, the second visibility, which are the ideas. And so what are ideas? They are the lines of force and dimensions which structure the primary visibility. Other terms Merleau-Ponty used: interior armature. He also said that the lining and the depth of the objects that condition the flesh as it is, as one of those clear zones, as one of those clearings. Ideas are also invisible, and so they're invisible in relation to the visible of the flesh, the visible of the things and the qualia which are formed in those clearings in flesh. And it's the second visibility then, which is actually invisible for Merleau-Ponty. He calls it the second visibility, but it is actually invisible, and it can never be visible. It's not just invisible for us now, and it could be revealed later, or it could be apparent to someone from a different perspective, from, say, a divine perspective. It's invisible and can never be visible because the idea structures the visible. It appears in those clearings as a structuring force, as the interior armature, the framework that conditions what appears in those clearings. So ideas also appear only through the sensible. They can only be given, Merleau-Ponty says, in a carnal experience. So it's not just that we need bodies and brains in order to think, because without them we wouldn't be here to think anything. It's that thought is connected to the sensible in such a way that it only appears through them. It can only be known, be accessed through a sensible experience. And that means that ideas are not explicitly graspable or positively expressible. They're so bound up with the sensible, with the carnal, with the visible, that to take them out of that, to try and understand them without that kind of visceral experience as a background, is impossible. Okay, so that's us. Man, this is a long video, right? It feels long. It feels like it took a long time to get done. But hopefully this helps. This is kind of an important idea. And this is why I didn't want to just rush over it. As you can see, there's quite a lot to say here. And it's a very different way of thinking about mind and consciousness. So hopefully I've done it some justice here anyway. Thanks for watching. And I'll catch you in the next video.